Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review. This is a special edition of the show, 2020 Year in Review, where we look at what's happened over the last year, what we think of as the most significant stories of the last year, and do a little prognosticating, put our thinking caps on and look into the future and say a little bit about what we think might be coming along at us in the future. As you can tell, I'm in a kind of a distorted area here. Those of you who've ever watched Doctor Who will recognize Doctor Who's time and spaceship, the TARDIS. And one unfortunate thing about borrowing the TARDIS from the Doctor is that the TARDIS it's driven by Artron energy. It's an energy that controls, I guess you'd say, or affects space-time. And unfortunately for us taping this episode tonight, or at least for me, where I'm sitting, you see kind of a lot of distortion here. That's the effect of the Artron energy, so just try to ignore it since I'm sitting here in the TARDIS tonight. And come along with us for the ride as we look into the past and maybe a little bit into the future, or at least give it a try. Rainer, Shay is our co-host along with me, Chris Driscoll. I should introduce myself. Rainer is a brilliant young man, in my opinion, who is a journalist, a Marxist-Leninist journalist who I think does a lot to give people an idea of what we in the Marxist-Leninist world are all about. So without any further ado, here is Rainer Shea. How you doing, Rainer?
Hello. I've been thinking about psychology, the psychology of power and how it relates to politics, and I've concluded that the people who are behaving in a counter-revolutionary way, they tend to be running away from something in their psyches. They tend to be trying to overcome some kind of insecurity, some kind of chip on their shoulder. This is certainly the case for Donald Trump. It's the case for all these blowhard online pundits or who are talking nonsense. It's the case, I imagine, for a lot of the people on Twitter who like to talk shit. And I'm over it. I'm over that kind of mindset. I'm not running away from something. I am pushing forward.
Okay, that sounds great. Onward, ever onward. What was it that Maurice Bishop used to say? Forward ever, backward never. That was a slogan that Maurice Bishop used. He was the prime minister of Grenada, who was overthrown and murdered in a coup d'etat, and then his country taken over by an American invasion in 1983. So I remember him fondly. He was a wonderful man. Grenada's actually a pretty small place. I think they have, at that time in the 80s, they had, I don't know, 100,000 people, something like that. So it's one of the smaller countries in the world. But real tragedy that befell the late, great Maurice Bishop. Anyway, moving on into our first topic of the night, 2020, year of the COVID plague. Since March, the COVID-19 pandemic, as these people call it, has taken more than 300,000 lives and infected over 17 million people in the United States. Record-breaking wildfires burned the West, and record-breaking hurricanes battered the Gulf Coast. Businesses shuttered, schools closed, and in May, the killing of George Floyd at the hands of police set off an ongoing movement to dismantle structural racism. That, at least that's the way these people put it. That is a quote from the Earth Institute from Columbia University, State of the Planet newsletter, their special year of 2020 review of the year. I thought that was a nice little summation. Certainly not everything, and there are lots of topics here tonight that we are going to cover that they didn't. More than 30 million Americans protested police murders in 70% of the counties of the country in June alone in the United States. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. And those protests continued well into the fall. And police murders, mostly of Black youth, continued, with the murder, for instance, of Breonna Taylor, a young EMT, emergency medical technician, while these out of control cops were serving a warrant at the wrong address. So they serve a warrant at the wrong address, and then they shoot the occupant of the apartment, who is totally unarmed. Brilliant, beautiful, young Black woman who was, I think, actually in her uniform, in her EMT uniform. And that's the kind of thing that people have been protesting throughout a good part of the last 7 or 8 months, since the end of May, when George Floyd was murdered by police. We'll get into George Floyd a little bit more a little bit later. In October, Trump announced that he and the First Lady had COVID-19. 2020 was a year like no other in American history, coalescing the worst plague in a century, the worst depression in more than a century, and maybe in our entire history, and the biggest uprising against the liberal police state in the nation's history. It was the mother of all social storms. Rainer, your thoughts in
I've
general?
been predicting this for a while. I had been predicting it for a while, observing how economic inequality, how the dismantling of the public sphere and social programs, the normalization of imperialist militarism, and consequently the increased danger of marginalized people in our society getting hurt because of law enforcement, the lack of an adequate healthcare system, the potential for proliferation of diseases as a result of climate change, global warming in general, and the general shrinking of capitalism, the general implosion of capitalism that's been causing the capitalist class to respond by foisting the costs of the crisis onto the lower classes, which leaves the lower classes more vulnerable to crises like COVID-19. Just last year, like almost exactly a year ago, I published an article whose headline went along the lines of 2020, the 2020s will be when America experiences a social collapse. And I didn't expect for it to happen this quickly. It seemingly came out of nowhere.
Yeah, very prescient on your part. This is really a reflection of, in reality, what's going on, the decline and crumbling of the American empire, decline in its influence around the world. It's still a powerful entity, but you know how these things go. Once you start seeing the decline, sometimes it can accelerate tremendously quickly. So we'll see. And sometimes it just drags its ass out and takes a while. So we'll see how that goes. I'm hoping for a quick ending, but you know, I always am. So, number 2 on the list tonight, firsts and number ones. Biden, the oldest and most senile, I think, person elected president in U.S. history. He's, I think they said he was going to be like 78 when he's made president on the 20th of January. And of course, Harris is the first Indian American to be elected vice president. First woman to be elected vice president. So, you know, number of firsts for America. Not that it matters much to any of us in the working class, other than things are going to get worse under these two despicable individuals. The USA was number one for most of the year since COVID-19 started as a plague, a pandemic, as they like to call it. I like to call it a plague because it really ties people back through the history of what these kinds of infections really are, what they're really like. And for thousands of years, people have called this plague. That's what it is. I think that's what we should call it. And I think in the end, people will come to that conclusion that this was a plague. Anyway, US was #1 for COVID deaths and infections. The highest ever recorded unemployment of 36% happened during this year. Higher actually than during any year during the Great Depression. As a for instance, the height of unemployment in the Great Depression was about 25%. And the beginning of the Greatest Depression, which actually didn't begin this year, we find out with adjusted figures. You know how they always come out and they announce these economic figures, the government I'm talking about, and then like 4 or 5 months later, after everybody's forgotten that news and it's all out of their minds, then they come out and with a little correction on page 34 of the newspaper. Oh, by the way, we're correcting our estimates that we announced in March. Now we've found out that the depression, which they call recession, but it is a depression. Have no doubt about it. They corrected it and said, well, this economic downturn actually started in the fourth quarter of 2019. But everybody became aware of this in 2020, and especially after March, when the economy started collapsing under the weight of COVID-19 and under the weight of the already existing depression, under the weight of shutdowns and so forth, that really affected the economy in even a more drastic way than I had predicted and anticipated. Because of course I knew and have predicted for several years now that around this time that a Great Depression would happen. That's no surprise to me, and it's no surprise to anyone who's listened to this show over the years, both during this time that we've been called the Revolutionary Socialist Review, and during the time prior to that we were called Carson's Corner with the election boycott advocates. This was pretty obvious to Marxists. I mean, I'm not smart. I'm not the brilliant guy, who's the only guy in the world who thought of this. Marxists all over the world were predicting this disastrous economic collapse would come, and it has. And of course, they are the bourgeoisie, are all predicting that we will have a quick recovery. China has had a quick recovery. China's already recovered, basically, economically. They're already back into growth. They're already projecting growth of 4 point something, almost 5% in 2021. And there's no surprise there, because they're not a capitalist economy. They're not a capitalist country. So of course they're going to recover from this much more quickly than any capitalist country does. But I have my suspicions that the economic downturn is not going to be over quite anywhere near, actually, so fast as these bourgeois economists are predicting. So much for number ones and firsts and so forth in this miserable year of 2020. Rainer, any thoughts?
I wonder how they're going to try to spin the narrative that the economy is vastly recovering. We're now going into the Biden era, the post-Trump era, where these liberal technocrats, these liberal pundits and politicians will be claiming that the last 4 years have just been a blip, have been an anomaly in the history of capitalism, the history of the United States, and they're going to try to spin the narrative that Biden is staving off the depression, that he's lifting Americans back up, and this could potentially be comparable to the narratives that emerged in the years after the 2008 crash, where due to the stock markets rising, these bourgeois figures were claiming that the economy had more than recovered, that the economy was doing great, and Trump tried to lean on this until it became incongruous to do so. But as will be the case during the Biden era, there's going to be a great bit of dissonance between what the economy is supposedly like and what the economy is really like, what people's daily lives are like. I wonder what the kinds of rhetoric that the president will be putting out will look like. Will he try to present himself as a kind of friend to the people like FDR presented himself as? It'll be harder for him to do so because Biden obviously is not even willing to carry out the kinds of social reforms that FDR carried out. He's just going to continue the imperialist projects. Well, it's really mind-boggling to think about, because there's such a shallowness to this narrative that these liberal technocrats are putting out, that they're going to be putting out as the working class suffers, as unemployment climbs, which is it's projected to do in this next year, as austerity continues to be implemented, and some of the only good news that I see in this world right now comes from China. As you said, it shows that there's a different way that humanity can build civilization. China is one of the few countries that's had improved living standards in this last year amid neoliberal capitalist world's descent into hell.
Yeah, that's true. They, I think they've already boxed themselves in. I mean, the Democrats have already boxed themselves in because they have gone with this narrative that first, this is a recession. They're really pumping heavily on this idea that this is a recession that was caused by COVID-19, despite the fact that it started even according to U.S. government figures, it started in the fourth quarter of 2019, and the COVID plague didn't really start in America until March. And it was actually not declared by the World Health Organization as a pandemic until March 11th, I believe it was. So they've already got themselves kind of boxed in to a narrative that is already full of cognitive dissonance. It's really amazing. You mentioned this dissonance. You mentioned that it's really not a surprise at all that this term that nobody had ever heard prior to 2008, cognitive dissonance, that it's become like a popular term now that people actually understand what it means, because because this shit just doesn't jive with reality. This crap that these people are putting out. A good point. Yeah. Okay. Next on the list, topic number 3: George Floyd and the struggle against the police state. George Perry Floyd. I didn't know his middle name was Perry. Born October 14, 1973. Died May 25th, 2020. Was an African-American man killed during an arrest after a store clerk alleged he had passed a counterfeit $20 bill in a Minneapolis store. Convenience store, I think it was. Derek Chauvin, one of the 4 police officers who arrived on the scene, knelt on Floyd's neck for a period initially reported to be 8 minutes and 46 seconds. After his death, protests against police brutality, uh, especially towards Black people, quickly spread across the United States and internationally. And I told you some of the early figures that were counted, of 30 million people, Americans at least in the United States, spread over 70% of the counties in the country. To me, that's just a phenomenal figure right there. And that was just in the first month, actually, less than a month after Floyd's murder. But this has really burgeoned. We'll be talking in the next point about what happened in Portland and Denver. And I am sure that there were many other examples of that kind of Gestapo style police arrests, as you, Rayner, termed it. But those are just the ones that that broke into the news. And it's, as we know, it's really difficult to break into the news these days. It's not like when I was your age. I mean, there were 50, 60 major, huge corporations that owned the overwhelming majority of the mass media in the United States that people heard. And today it's been whittled down to 6 major corporations. And so because of that, there's such a tight stranglehold on what Americans hear typically, unless we unless we tune into shows like this, unless we consult Marxist Leninist newspapers and uh, uh, radio shows, TV or video shows, unless we really consult the alternative left media, in other words, and that actually more than that, the Marxist Leninist media, because most of what's called the left media is really just liberals spouting, parroting the bullshit that CNN and MSNBC and Fox News say. So, yeah, it really is difficult to break through all that to get a story out. So anyway, George Floyd and what we saw over these months since the end of May.
It's notable that this is the issue that inflamed these protests that we all knew on some level were inevitably going to take place in 2020. I think after the pandemic hit and tens of millions of jobs started being lost around March or April, it was pretty obvious that America had become more of a social powder keg than ever. It's already been a social powder keg since 2008, and in 2020, the class tensions got even more pronounced, perhaps more pronounced than they've been in many decades. And the inciting incident was a repeat of the phenomena that we've seen so many times in this last decade as a result of the rise of social media, like in parallel to, it was the Michael Brown. There's the other guy who said, "I can't breathe." Feel like I should know his name. His name is on the tip of my tongue. There's so many of these guys who've been killed in this horrifying way, and also Breonna Taylor, and even after then there was I think it was somebody in August. It was August, might have been, when you told me the story about how this autistic black kid was killed by the police, and this showed that even after the protests, this systemic issue persisted.
Right.
So
that was the one who was singing in the street. He liked to sing and then dance in the street. And it was quite near his home. And some neighbors saw him singing and dancing and walking along. And they thought, oh my God, there's something wrong with that boy. Well, I mean, there was something different about the boy. But they, called the police. And of course, the police came and did what police do. And the kid was autistic. The police immediately come and try to restrain him. Why restrain people when they're singing and dancing? What harm did that do to anybody? Yeah, it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. That sparked more big protests. I mean, as though we needed more sparking, because the protests were already going. So yeah, it's just, yeah, we should, keep a list with us of all these young people, mostly young males. Although there's Breonna Taylor that, there's always a, uh, uh, um, there's always something that proves the rules, so to speak. Um, anyway, yeah, it's such a tragedy, and people are just getting more and more angry, as they should. Righteous anger, I call it. And as a result, people are out in the streets, and it's spilling over into all kinds of other issues. I mean, the signs that I saw. First of all, to me, one of the things that was amazing about this whole eruption in America was, that it wasn't just black people, which we would expect, because black people are the vanguard of the American working class, number one, and because this was happening to black young black, mostly black males. So we know that there is a great justified and righteous anger among within the black community. But this anger was exhibited by people of all colors, all nationalities, all ethnic groups. I think probably all religions, and even those of us who are not religious, those of us who are dyed-in-the-wool naturalist atheists. So, like me, um, everybody, in other words. I mean, the this was really a rainbow coalition, as Jesse Jackson might once have called it. And that was thrilling to see, I thought. It was thrilling to see. The other thing is, mostly young people. This was mostly young people, which, that's a good sign as well. So we see more and more of this radicalization among the youth in America, with more than 50% of the youth openly proclaiming that they're socialists. That's never happened in the history of the United States. Believe me. I lived during the so-called radical 60s and early 70s. But I watched the statistics then. It was like maybe 10% of the people said they were socialists, and in the year 1970, 10% of the people said they were socialists. Here,
Remember, yeah, and remember the post I made about a typical American conversation in 1968?
yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Where
these people, they thought they were radical because they were basically because they were protesting, you know, for civil rights, and they were protesting for against the Vietnam War, which they didn't want to go to, and they knew they were going to be drafted to it. They were there was a lot of like self-interests involved there, which is no problem with self-interest. That's good. That's good if it moves people into progressive revolutionary action. But these were not socialists. These were people who had been brought up. I mean, I know, I was around them. I was a socialist then, a revolutionary socialist then. So I know what those people were like. My generation, and most of them were. They had capitalism in the brain so deep that the thought, and they had the fear of communism drilled into them. It was amazing. I mean, that still existed in the late 60s and early 70s, that fear of being identified as a as a communist, just from what happened in the McCarthy era. People knew that it could destroy your career, it could destroy your lives, it could destroy your, get you kicked out of your apartment, get you kicked out of your job. So, there was still a lot of fear there. So there was that. And a lot of that has kind of dissipated, thankfully, even though the far right does whatever they can to try to promote it, to bring back the good old days of McCarthyism. So, yeah, things have changed tremendously. And I think that I just keep seeing a deeper and deeper radicalization among the youth. I mean, I'm sure that 10 years ago, when a majority of the youth were first being reported as saying that they were socialists back in like 2009, 2010, when I first started seeing these polls coming out, I'm sure back then they had no clue what socialism was. They just knew that things were real bad. We're in the middle of what they called a recession, but was really, really bad recession. That things were really bad, and socialism could help people out when they were getting kicked out of their homes, when they were losing their jobs, when they were poverty stricken to the point where they had no money to pay for anything. I think that's what people started out with at the beginning of that so-called Great Recession, which was really a depression. Um, they have come a long way in this 10 years. I see a real radicalization happening among the youth. We'll see how it turns out. You know, there's a lot of propaganda coming at those people as well, attempting to try to steer them off away from Marxism, Leninism, away from discovering that. That's their real aim, you know, because they realize, well, you know, we hate it that they become social democrats, but it would be so much worse if they were actually anti-imperialist, Marxist, Leninist, revolutionary socialist, communists. It would be so much worse. So let's figure out a way to get these social democrat kids to, you know, become like good old Bernie, who's a good pro-imperialist social democrat. That's
Yeah,
what they'll be after. I mean, that's what they did in
yeah,
the 50s to try to counter the growth of communists and socialists left in the United States. And they were quite successful back then. So I don't think they're going to be successful this time. And, you know, part of the armor we need to get against that is the knowledge of what they did back then. So anyway, anything more on George Floyd and this eruption that we've been seeing?
no.
Okay. The next point, Portland and Denver Gestapo style police arrests. And while you introduce this, I hope you can think of enough to say to give me a break, and I'll be back in just a few minutes, hopefully real quickly. And hopefully by the time you're finished doing your intro to this topic.
Right. It was a real, it was a real wake up call when this happened in July, where these unmarked vehicles were sent to Portland, and these sketchy federal agents, apparent federal agents. There was a rumor that they were Blackwater, but apparently that's unverified. These sketchy guys without official marks on their uniforms, and these unmarked vehicles, they apparently shove people into these vehicles at random with no apparent charges. And I don't think any long-term jail time was made. It was just a scare tactic. These people were pretty quickly released, and it's clear that the motive for them taking this approach was theatrical. It was dramatic. It was to instill fear among those who might show up to protests. And there's another thing that I had been anticipating prior to 2020, that the state would escalate the level of its repression, like Occupy Wall Street, but more intense. So for me, the news of these Gestapo-style arrests were both shocking and not shocking. There's kind of a trend for how I've reacted to events this year. Shocking, but at the same time, not shocking in the least, because I had studied the conditions of our society prior to 2020, and I had known exactly where all of this was heading, because I've looked at the parallels to what's happening now, like in terms of the past countries that have veered towards fascism. And really, all you need to look at when you're looking for a society that's veering towards fascism is U.S. history. There's book called "It Can't Happen Here." Not all that well written book, but it's an interesting book because it shows a hypothetical scenario where the equivalent of Hitler is elected in the U.S. in 1936, and he makes the U.S. into a fascist state where no one's allowed to criticize the government, and all these people are put into camps. And at the beginning of the book, a character makes a point that's more applicable than ever. They say, you say that it can't happen here, that fascism can't happen here in the United States. Just look at the repression of Black and Indigenous people. I don't know if they exactly said Black and Indigenous people. That sounds pretty woke, but that sounds pretty woke for an author of the time. But you get what I'm saying. Look at this repression that was carried out by all of these campaigns throughout U.S. history up to that point, like during the era of Prohibition, and the World War I anti-war repression of anti-war speakers. Look at all of this state violence that's been present in U.S. history, and think of where it could lead to. Think of how far it could be taken.
Yeah. Yeah. That I'm glad you raised that point, because it's an important point. I used to make that point all the time, and I've kind of dropped away from it, though, that police repression has been on and off, has been a big aspect of the American state, and so much particularly during the great so-called Red Scare of the post-World War I period, 1920, 1921, in that time when they rounded up and arrested communists and socialists all over the country who were foreign born, and just kicked them out of the country, deported them, or jailed them. And then there was the McCarthy period, which is what was another big, that you've mentioned, the period of police repression in America, and that harkens back to what I was talking about before, about the fear that developed out of the McCarthy period, to the point where even young people who might have thought secretly that they were leaning socialists wouldn't ever say that, not even to a pollster, because there was such a great fear around it. You had to really be a crazy fucker like me to to do that. I was determined pretty much from when I discovered revolutionary socialism to proclaim that. Although I still had to be kind of careful, like on the job, for instance, or around certain people, you didn't want to mention your proclivities. Those were the days. Not so hot. So yeah, that this thing that's happened in Portland and Denver, and as I said, I am positive that it has happened in many, many other cities in the country, but because there's such a repression of information, because a monopoly of 6 gigantic corporations controls 95% of what the American people hear and see and read, every day from their mass media, from their mass news media. The monopolization has gotten to the point where it is detrimental in and of itself. It is detrimental to democratic discussions among the people in the United States, because how can you have a democratic discussion if you don't have the information that you need as a citizen, that you need to know to have a discussion that has bearing on what's going on? There's never, ever been democracy in the United States, not at the federal level, at least, and mostly not at the state level. And even at the local level, it's kind of rare. But at least there used to be democratic discussions where people, heard different points of view from like 70 or 80 major corporations that controlled the media at that time, back when I was a kid. You don't have any of that anymore. There were actually times when the mass media would break a story, like the My Lai massacre, for example. That would never come out today in today's under today's media. It would have immediately been squashed, covered up, so yeah, I really don't think we're hearing what's really going on. But we did see what went on in Portland. We did see what went on in Denver with the anti-racist activists. I mean, I noticed PSL calls them anti-racist activists. They are anti-racist activists, but I think more pertinent is that they are communist activists, and that's the real reason that these four individuals, this is the amazing thing about what went on in Denver. There was a crowd of at least 1,500 people, probably more, surrounding this entire police station, protesting because of police shootings in Denver, and because of the George Floyd murder, and just because they were out protesting against the whole police state. And out of those 1,500, at least 1,500, probably a lot more than that, people, probably more like 3,000 people, the police just happened to pick out four random people. These weren't in particular, like the elected major leader of the group or anything. They were leaders and, thought leaders or, action leaders because of what they did and what they spoke about, but they weren't necessarily anywhere, I mean, this was a spontaneous crowd. It wasn't some, organization with leaders. And yet these four people were chosen by the police and by the Denver courts, Denver DA's office. I mean, these were chosen to give this special attention. If you think of, think of what the penalty is for kidnapping. It's a major crime with a major felony with major jail time, prison time. This is the kind of, and why are they doing that? Because they're starting to fear what we know, which is that as people radicalize more and more through this terrible, terrible process, what I called earlier the mother of all social storms, as people radicalize through this, they will more and more turn towards Marxist-Leninists for their leadership, for the ideas of revolution. That's what they're afraid of. That's why they arrested those four people. To me, it's pretty significant. And it's still something. I'm glad that we had this chance to revisit that issue because the Party of Socialism and Liberation, the PSL, is still fighting on the behalf of these four individuals, these four framed individuals with these absurd charges that they kidnapped the police. The police were cowering. The police had fucking combat, assault rifles, fully automatic. The people outside had nothing. So why in fuck were these pigs afraid of anything, much less thinking that they were kidnapped? It's ridiculous. So, anything else you want to add?
I can make the observation that the United States has never really been a democracy, not just because it's a capitalist state and capitalist so-called democracy is always hypocritical, but because from the start the United States has been a society rife with contradictions. It's built on stolen land. Its wealth was built upon slavery. Its wealth continues to be built upon slavery by many definitions of the term. And there are these social classes, these marginalized groups, the descendants of slaves, and these natives who are pushed aside by the colonial projects, by neocolonialism, who remain at odds with law enforcement. We often don't mention that natives have recently statistically been killed, the demographic that's been killed most by police, like in statistical proportional terms, which is totally unsurprising since natives are as much victims of colonialism as blacks are. So all the time, these contradictions seem to be bubbling up. There's race riots in every decade or so, or famous race riots, racial tensions, outrage at police brutality, like the Rodney King riots, and before then it was these civil rights protests, the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, and now it's come back to the forefront. The capitalist media is being forced to talk about it again because this issue of systemic racism refuses to go away as long as the United States exists, as long as a revolution hasn't happened. So naturally, there's these waves of repression and reaction and warfare between the oppressor nation, if you can call the United States a nation, and the oppressed nationalities.
Yeah, very important point. The United States of America, right from 1776, was a colonizing and colonialist project. They started out with the vision when they had just this narrow sliver of Atlantic coast territory. They had this vision that they would march across the American continent, conquering as they went, displacing and ethnic cleansing as they marched across, which is exactly what they did. So it was kind of a proto-Nazi thing from the get-go. And of course, the overwhelming majority of people, didn't fit into their conception of what America was going to be all about. They meaning the ruling class at that time in 1776 and in 1788 when they signed the Constitution and formed the United States of America as with a centralized federal government. They had that they had the conception that this was for a tiny number of the people in America, that didn't include anyone who didn't own property, didn't include anyone who was considered under the law property, slaves, for instance. It didn't include any one of the female sex. So, yeah. And their idea right from the start, you read Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, people like that, they were already speaking of the glory that they saw to come in the conquest of this great continent, of which these mostly Englishmen had just a small amount of, and everybody else was basically serfs and slaves. So, yeah, that's not democracy. To call it democracy is ludicrous. That's why I'm always amazed, when you look at the discussions of ancient Rome and ancient Greece. And they talk about Athens, this wonderful democracy. I mean, this democracy in which most of the people were slaves, this democracy in which most of the people had no say, no vote. That's not democracy. And at that same time, there were cultures all over the fucking world that had real democracy. But these idiots still teach in the high schools that that slavocracy uh, in Greece and Rome, that those slavocracies were democracy, and they still teach that the American slavocracy in 1776 was democracy. They teach lies, in other words.
Yeah, no
While
wonder.
you look at the Native American nations at that time, there were several of them that had really brilliant democracies that included all people in their societies.
Yeah, no wonder why the glorification of Greece and Rome is central to how a lot of these fascists market themselves, how the Nazis and Mussolini and these modern day cringy LARPer alt-right types market themselves. Like
Yeah.
they promote nostalgia for Rome, say that Rome is the father of Western civilization, which you can argue for, but it's not something that we should glorify all that much. It's not something we should idealize.
Yeah. Well, the founding fathers of the United States, and I emphasize father. I've had a lot of people tell me, "Oh, you shouldn't say father. That's sexist." Fuck you, idiots. These were men and only men, and women were not fucking allowed. The founding fathers glorified Rome and Greece, all of them. Why? The empire. They had empire on the brain. They wanted to build an empire. That's why the American education system has been so replete with this form of imperial propaganda, because they want this to be the ideology, the hegemony of ideology, as what's his name, the Italian guy, would say.
Grumsky.
Gramsci, thank you. Yeah, as Gramsci would say. That it's something that the ruling classes have always pushed in the United States, and they still push it today. It's still, I mean, I haven't been in a high school in 50 years, more than 50 years, but that's I'm sure that's what they're still teaching, the same racist, Eurocentric garbage, you know. So anyway, next up, topic 5, global working class uprising against neoliberalism. Now, this is the thing. I think this is will in the future we will look back and say this was the turning point. I think that this might actually be the most important discussion we have. The global working class uprising against neoliberalism. From Chile and Colombia to Paris and Berlin to India, the global working class over the last year, more than a year, but particularly over the last year, over the last maybe year and several months, I should say, the global working class is rising up against neoliberalism and capitalist classes that promote it. And we've seen this also in America, with the slogans and signs that people come to the George Floyd marches. They're angry about the police state, but they're raising other points too, like neoliberalism, like austerity, like unemployment, like, you know, people being kicked out of their homes, all of the detritus, is that how you say the word, detritus, that the fallout from neoliberalism. Say it again.
Right. Detritus.
Detritus. There you go. Anyway, that's to me, this has been the most amazing thing. You look at what happened in Chile last year, or I mean earlier this year. The fucking government in the capital city of Chile was literally run out of the fucking city. They couldn't operate in their own city, in their own capital city. That's, you know, and huge demonstrations in Colombia. We think of only, you know, people in Colombia as being these cowed, these poor working class cowed people that, you know, because they have this brutal ruling class that's affiliated and aligned with the American empire. And we haven't seen a lot of action in Colombia in many, many decades, but we saw it this last year with huge demonstrations, really all over Latin America. There were huge, huge demonstrations, specifically raising anti-neoliberal, anti-austerity issues. This was really, really a big upsurge. And as I said, I think we saw it in America through the George Floyd protests, the anti-police brutality protests and so forth, where people were raising all these other issues. And, you know, I think COVID-19 has put a clamp kind of on what people would do, even though we saw tens of millions of people protesting around George Floyd. The COVID-19 has put a clamp on our movement, our, you know, going out. Hell, I've hardly been out of the house in the last, you know, since March, really. And I don't want to go out into this COVID environment and these COVID pits. I mean, I hear these stories of people not wearing masks in grocery stores and so forth. And I think, well, I'm an old man. Maybe I should just stay away from all that shit. And I do. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have some family that'll go out to the grocery store and that kind of thing, or else more commonly, we just order from, whatever the local store is that brings the food to you. I mean, actually, pretty much all of them do that now, I think. They deliver. So anyway, to me, this was an extraordinary year just for that, if not anything else. And there was so much else.
Yep. Capitalism's contradictions have been heightened. This is on top of what we were observing over a year ago, where throughout Latin America, all these mass movements were breaking out, from Honduras to Colombia to Chile. Brazil has been seemingly a different case from what I've been able to tell so far. I don't know if an equivalent mass movement has broken out in Brazil, and if not, I wonder why. I wonder what it could signal for the state of class struggle in Brazil, because Bolsonaro, to his credit, has vastly accelerated the process of class struggle by antagonizing the proletariat so much. He destroyed the social safety programs prior to COVID-19. He destroyed the educational system. A year ago, a Brazilian put out a column saying Bolsonaro destroyed my country in 400 days. And that was just before COVID-19 happened, after which, predictably, Brazil became one of the most COVID impacted countries on the planet, where Bolsonaro was governing in a kind of a similar way to how Trump has been handling the pandemic, where he was on the fence about acknowledging its seriousness. He was so nonchalant. He once said, "What am I?" Something like, "What am I, the Messiah? I can't fix it all on my own." And hilariously, he once said, "If I get it, I'll be fine. I do lots of athletics, soccer, so my body is in good shape." But despite his confidence, Brazil has undergone an epic tragedy, and similar things have been the case in countries like India, another one of the countries that's been impacted among the most by COVID-19. Russia is another one of the countries that I've seen. It might be in the top 10 list of countries with most COVID deaths. The UK is another one. These countries that have dipped most deeply into neoliberal austerity throughout this neoliberal era, that have been pummeled by neoliberal economic self-destruction. They've been hit hard. They've been hit the hardest, and it's only a matter of time till class struggle subsumes them in to the extent that it's begun to subsume countries like Colombia. Just in this last month, India, for example, has experienced this farmer strike.
That we'll be talking about that in the topic coming up here pretty quick. Meanwhile, topic number 6, the fascist reaction of the ruling class to all of this. Now, Rainer, you wrote a stupendous article not long ago covering what we can expect. So this is more a prognostication as well as an observation of what's been going on, of what the ruling class is going to do in response to all this upsurge.
Right. I don't know exactly which one you're referring to. I write about this all the time, but it seems like you might be referring to the one that talks about how our conditions are going to become far more brutal than they are now. That
Yes.
there's this process of inequality that's accelerating, inequality between the living conditions of the metropolitan elite and the conditions of the proletariat, the tens of millions of unemployed in this country. And I think the unemployment rate is still growing despite the supposed process of recovery. So it's going to continue to get a lot worse for the lower classes, and there's going to be this process of reaction where, as these new technologies are introduced, as AI becomes more proliferated, as it becomes more integrated into our daily lives, the benefits of technology are going to be felt primarily by the rich, while technology's potentials for evil will be felt by the poor. What the so-called fourth industrial revolution means for the poor is an expansion of the militarized police state that we've been seeing throughout the war on terror, as America's wars have come home, so to speak, and as this excess military equipment from America's forever wars have been transferred to the local police departments. We're going to see more of this as the fourth industrial revolution, as they call it, continues, and as the capitalist state leans more on the high-tech sector to try to fortify its war machine and to try to fortify its police and surveillance states. I think a very interesting dynamic is going to appear in the history of class struggle as the Great Reset, as they call it, is put in place, and as this technology is normalized throughout our society, because the rich will be the ones who can access the utopian vision that these Silicon Valley technocrats envision, where there will be self-driving cars, there will be an internet of things, all of the rich's appliances will be connected to the internet, and the rich won't have to go to the store, or the stores will become obsolete in rich land, because everything will be able to be ordered online. So you can see how Amazon will benefit. And the rich will create these little utopias in their metropolitan centers, will the poor become subject to the high-tech warfare from a state that's determined to try to clamp down on the growing instability in society. This connects to, I think this connects to Israel and Gaza, because Israel and its imperialist partners have handled this situation of a massive underclass of deeply impoverished people who are determined to wage revolution against this oppressor country by subjecting these poor people to intensive surveillance and tight restrictions on their movement, and by subjecting them to a situation of a war zone, of really terrorism against the population, and these really tight authoritarian state control measures. So more of these things are going to appear throughout the capitalist world as late stage capitalism continues. And in the United States, it's especially going to be apparent within these colonized communities, like these cities where the state has sent the militarized police and the National Guard to try to terrorize the population in response to peaceful protests.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's oh so important. That's something you also wrote a great article about not too long ago. The idea that the American imperialist wars and Israeli imperialist war against the Palestinian people, that these wars have been test beds for tactics, fascist tactics, that they plan to bring home and that they've already been bringing home during this George Floyd uprising. It is, I think, such an important concept to understand. As we Marxist Leninists have been predicting in the last several years an upsurge of radicalism, an upsurge of protest, an upsurge of uprisings in the country. So too have the thinkers of the capitalist class been predicting this as well, and they've been getting ready for it. And this is their response. Absolutely. Their response is a fascist response, ramping up the fascism. That's why, you know, contrary to what every liberal in the country expects, they're going to end up being quite surprised what Biden and his sidekick, the top cop, Kamala Harris, what they're going to bring to us. This, you know, as we say, that this has already been breaking out in many parts of the country. We're seeing it. We saw it in Washington, D.C., my hometown, with the deployment of military police against protesters, peaceful, totally peaceful protesters. And in that case, if you'll recall, it was just so that they could clear all the protesters out from in front of the White House, so President Emperor Trump could waddle his way across Lafayette Square or Lafayette Park into the church across from the Lafayette Park on the other side of Lafayette Park from the White House to hold up a Bible in front of the church. That was it. Just a photo op. And he sicked all these military police on the protesters in that instance, which is a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act of I can't remember, 1878 or something like that. They could give a fuck about the law, you know. The law's not for them, the law's for us, basically. The law is for them to oppress us. Anyway, next on the list here, the extra legal execution of Qasem Soleimani, General Qasem Soleimani, the famous national hero of Iran, who was more instrumental than any other single individual in beating ISIS in Syria when he was leading the Revolutionary Guard force in Syria the Iranian Revolutionary Guard force in Syria, helping the Syrian government at the Syrian government's request, by the way, which is legal. U.S. Trump's troops in Syria are not legal. They are a violation of international law. They are illegal troops. They are an illegal invasion of Syria. But Soleimani, who's really much more instrumental in defeating ISIS in Syria than the Americans were, because the Americans were helping them, were actually arming them and funding them surreptitiously. Qasem Soleimani was executed extra legally by an American missile attack in Iraq when he was in Iraq visiting there to take part in a peace process that they hoped to get underway under the auspices of the government of Iraq. At the government of Iraq's invitation, the American terrorists, the American empire, which is a terrorist, it's the worst terrorist on the planet, executed Soleimani on January 3rd of this year. And a terrible tragedy, incredibly provocative jab at the people of Iran. And this is just just one episode in the illegal activity that the American empire has been waging against Iran. And to me, it was surprising how restrained Iran was in their reaction. But it's pretty obvious from all this that the American government, the American military, the American espionage forces are hell bent on starting a war against Iran. It's pretty much too late for Trump already. I mean, Trump's got he's got what, 3 weeks to go or something like that. He's got less than a month to go. So I kind of doubt that Trump's going to be able to start something. So that'll leave it to Biden. And Biden, in his rhetoric, has already indicated in every possible way that he will attempt in whatever way he can to spread more of these acts of war against Iran. Iran is absolutely no threat to the United States. It's ridiculous for the United States to claim that. What Iran is, though, is they are a threat because of their example of being anti-imperialists. They are a threat. So they are a threat to the Americans just because of the example that they provide to the other predominantly Muslim countries in the Middle East, that crucial Southeast Asia where so much oil resides.
You made a good point about how simply by being an example of a country that stands up to U.S. hegemony, they're a threat. They certainly are one of the many threats to the domination of the world by the United States, by these imperialists. This is why it's important to defend all of these countries from the false narratives that are spread around about them. This is why we need to defend the DPRK in China, even though they're well-armed states that couldn't ever realistically be conquered by the U.S. I think it's most important to defend socialist states because they're an example of what kind of world we could build if we were to defeat this ideological hegemony, as Gramsci described it, and create a proletarian democracy within our own society. The ability to compare our own conditions with the conditions of other countries is so limited by the extent of imperialist propaganda, and it's created a blind spot within the American psyche where these Americans can't imagine any different system. They can't imagine any alternative to U.S. NATO hegemony and implicitly to the idea of endless war. This is what it comes down to: the justification for making war endless.
Mm-hmm.
And that there's the depressing reality of 21st century U.S. imperialism that anybody who supports the continuation of the United States, who doesn't support the idea of revolution, is rationalizing the idea of making war endless.
Right.
I mean, sure, Biden will try to obfuscate and conceal the wars that he's going to continue. He's going to claim that he's reaching out towards Iran, or that he's trying to end Trump's excessive provocations against Iran. But as Stalin said, when a bourgeois diplomat claims that he's seeking peace, that he's trying to carry out a reconciliation, obviously that diplomat is untrustworthy, because underhandedly the diplomat's imperialist government is working to try to undermine the sovereignty of the nation that it's supposedly seeking peace with. And there's where the cognitive dissonance comes in again. Supposedly, right, the U.S. wants peace, but continuously it's working to perpetuate war in some form.
Right. Okay. Next up, big tech promotes mass surveillance dystopia under cover of COVID-19. Rainer Shea.
In 2018, the National Defense Authorization Act mandated the creation of a new agency, if you can call it an agency. I think it's called the National Security Artificial Intelligence Council, or something along those lines. I don't quite remember the acronym, but it's purposed with officially marrying the intelligence and military sector with big tech. It's concerned with making it so that Silicon Valley elites, tech elites, can directly coordinate with these intelligence entities, with the U.S. government, towards, well, to what purpose, for what end do they want to coordinate? This became clearer in this last year when COVID-19, this big crisis, created a need to restructure society and disrupted everyone's lives, and created the need for us to utilize technology to keep our lives functional. And this collection of intelligence and Silicon Valley elites took advantage of the situation to try to push towards the creation of what they call smart cities, which will involve the increasing normalization of mass surveillance, AI-driven mass surveillance specifically, surveillance where ultimately people will have all of these appliances that are connected to the internet, and that can be used to gather data and potentially to spy on people's political conversations, even more so than the government is able to spy on our political conversations that we have over devices like the one I'm talking to right now. These elites plan to, as I said, normalize a kind of brave new world where all of these modern conveniences have been normalized. Conveniences like self-driving cars, the obsolescence of retail, and Internet of Things. And as I said, the benefits of these technologies will primarily go to the rich, while the poor bear the brunt of the potential that technology has to be used for evil. We're going to be subjected to a police state that has updated means for monitoring us, for engaging in combat against us, for making our lives more strictly controlled. And this is what the so-called Great Reset is about. It's about normalizing these technologies that will be used for social control. It's not surprising that the more reactionary segments of society, like the COVID-19 deniers and the people who claim that COVID-19 is just one big hoax by the global elites, that they've seized upon trends like these to try to push the narrative that we shouldn't worry about the virus, that the virus is a hoax. This is something I've been seeing from the right wingers who worry about online censorship and about big tech's ability to manipulate people's minds through algorithms. They see the contradictions within the system. They see the dystopian implications of this, but their solution is to go off on some right-wing survivalist mission where that will probably end up with them eventually waging war against marginalized peoples in a dystopian future. This isn't what we want as communists. We want to become the kinds of survivalists who seek out a path away from the state with the purpose of waging war against the state, with the purpose of smashing this dictatorship that we live under, and that's being fortified by the normalization of these technologies.
Yeah, that it's a frightening prospect that's happening right before our eyes. There are so many aspects of dystopia that we see, especially in this year, coming from the US government, coming from the capitalist class, coming from the giant corporations, which are smaller and smaller in number, but larger and larger in power. We see this same frightening thing over and over again in every aspect of life, but certainly in all those aspects that are covered by big tech, and how the capitalists have bastardized and misused big tech, because big tech should be an enabler for the working class, an enabler for humanity. It should enable us to become everything that we can possibly be as human beings, but instead it's being used to repress and to frighten and terrorize us. It's really just frightening aspect of the uh, growing fascist dystopia that the capitalist ruling class is fostering right now, because they don't know any other way to deal with the crisis that they're obviously in, the crisis of collapse, the crisis of swift decline of their power. That's what they fear. That's what they're preparing for with all this fascist uh, dystopia. So, well done. Okay, next on the list is the defeat of the Bolivia coup, which is another great example coming up to us from Latin America, especially from the socialist wave that has had its ups and downs in the last couple of years. Bolivia being the one of the worst down, but a quick spring back for Bolivia. So, Rainer, what are your thoughts on that?
Right, right. It's shown that Bolivia, as of now, in its current conditions, with the strength of its socialist movement, it can't be brought back towards the fold of U.S. imperialism. It can't be brought back to the reactionary state that they brought it towards throughout that year when the coup regime was in power. At least they can't bring it back to that point for a sustainable amount of time, because the MAS movement, it has the backing of the indigenous majority. It has the backing of the proletariat that's suffering under this pandemic and under this austerity that the Áñez regime started to implement for the benefit of U.S. imperialism. They're not having any of it, and the Áñez regime, it used massacres, it used intimidation of political opponents, it used censorship of the media to try to. It also used attempted election rigging to try to shut down the resurgence of the socialist movement. But all of that was not strong enough to preserve the regime. The regime had to fall at some point. And I think that if the regime hadn't called new elections in August, if it hadn't made that concession, then pretty soon the regime would have been run out of the capital, and Áñez would have had to flee in a helicopter, because these socialists, these indigenous people, they're militant. They've escalated it to armed struggle, even though Evo Morales himself was pretty lukewarm about encouraging armed struggle when he was president. And now we're at a point where well, I don't know how much it's going to resemble the Chavez Maduro government, where Chavez and Maduro have built up a 1 million strong official revolutionary army. I don't know if the new socialist president in Bolivia will try to do this, or if he'll be more cautious and lukewarm like Morales was. But either way, the forces of class struggle are so strong, so present in Bolivia, that if they try to do another coup in Bolivia, which, let's be honest, they will, it's not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be a sustainable option for the imperialists. It seems like their only option is to militarily invade the country and occupy it through some brutal dictatorship that tries to kill much of the population off, like they killed off much of the population during Argentina's dictatorship, and during Bolivia's old dictatorship, and during Pinochet's dictatorship, the dictatorship in Brazil. It's not going to be able to go back to that point of strong imperialist control in Latin America. It seems, at least not whereas Bolivia is concerned. I don't know about the other countries in Latin America, because they're increasingly drifting towards militarization and towards repression and towards the deterioration of democracy. Bolsonaro is an example of how democracy in Latin America is being undermined by the forces of capitalist reaction. So we're going to have to see to what extent the rest of Latin America is now ready to join countries like Bolivia and Venezuela in becoming anti-imperialist. I wonder how soon the next Latin American country will turn from a neo-colony to an anti-imperialist state. I wonder if Colombia will be the next, because the forces of class struggle there are so strong.
Yeah, it is something that we need to keep a close eye on, and I will be keeping a close eye on it. Thankfully, we've got media sources like the Gray Zone, for example, which consistently report on what's going on in these revolutionary countries, and as well in the other Latin American countries that are that are showing this big upsurge in radicalization. So, okay, finally, topic number 10. What we expect from 2021 in the coming decade. This is a chance for us to put our crystal ball out, so to speak, and prognosticate a little bit. Of course, using the methodology of Marx and Engels, the historical materialism and dialectical materialism, which is a great method of analyzing what we do know and projecting from there. Just today, whatever this is, December 28th, Trump signed the new COVID relief bill today that gives hundreds of billions away to the billionaire class, while giving about $1 billion away to the working class in the form of $600 checks to all adults. Trump had earlier insisted that he wanted Congress to give everybody a $2,000 relief check, which of course would have still been quite pathetic as far as what people are facing. You know, when you have like 40, 50 million people facing being kicked out of their houses because they've got back rent and back mortgage payments for months and months and months. $2,000 wouldn't cut it, and certainly the miserly $600 that the Democrats voted for, and many Republicans as well, is not going to cut it. Meanwhile, today, President-elect, Emperor-elect, I think we should call him, Biden, held a national security press briefing in which he blamed the sorry state of the empire, of the American empire, on Trump's disengagement from Washington's junior imperialist allies and the gutting of the federal government agencies, and including the so-called Department of Defense. Did you know that that used to be called the Department of War?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a observation among anti-war people.
Yeah, it was a much more appropriate when it was called the Department of War. Anyway, the Department of War is one example Biden used as that Trump has basically gutted the civilian leadership in that department of the federal government. Biden also clearly targeted Russia and China as the main threats to the American empire. And of course, Russia and China, for the same reason as I said about Iran before, Russia and China are a big threat to the future of the American empire, to American imperialism, because they are a living, positive example that nations do not have to buckle under, do not have to kowtow to the American bully on the block, do not have to submit to the dictates of American imperialism, and they don't. So yes, they are big threats to the American empire, and that's the way the American empire sees them, and that's the way the American empire treats them, Trump included. Trump always treated Russia like an enemy, not like the friend that he promised he would treat them like. He from the get-go. In reality, China and Russia are the main threats to global hegemon, the American empire, because they're an example to the rest of the world that you don't have to kowtow to the evil empire. That is a positive example. The American imperialists cannot allow to stand low, no, or negative growth, and the major credit crunch and inflation as quantitative easing of the last year is something that I particularly expect in the coming year. That's really going to hit the fan because of the consequences of this huge quantitative easing. And what is quantitative easing, for those of you who don't know what it is? I mean, there was a time when I didn't know. It's when central banks, like the Federal Reserve System is the American central bank, create huge debits on their ledgers. In other words, they create credit and then give that credit away, trillions of dollars worth of it, to the major monopoly corporations in America and to the billionaires, essentially. They're giving away billions of dollars. On top of the billions of dollars Trump signed into law today, coming straight from the federal government, these trillions of dollars coming from quantitative easing to the billionaires and their corporations. They're huge, monopoly Fortune 500 corporations are the beneficiaries of most of this quantitative easing. Some people call it helicopter money. They drop money because when you give people this credit, they don't have to pay it back. It's like getting a loan but not having to pay it back. They just get to spend the money. Where's the money come from? The ether. It's inflation. It's future inflation is all it is. So you know that that's going to happen. This is fake money. It's the creation of massive amounts of fake money. So on top of the already existing global depression, on top of the environmental catastrophes, on top of COVID-19, in the coming year, we're going to definitely see that. And it's coming that quickly because I mean the indicators are already showing a rise in inflation. The indicators are already showing a depreciation of the dollar. A collapse of the dollar may well be in the offing. So there's one prognostication from me, and I'm sure there's lots of others. I've just gone over a little bit of what just happened today with Trump and Biden and their threats against China and Russia, their acts of war, basically. Um, and over this discussion, Rainer, you have gone over, what we can expect in the way of frightening tech fascism, tech dystopia, high tech dystopia. We've gone over some of this already, but this is your chance to put on your prognosticator's hat and tell us, what do you expect?
How about the fall of the dollar? We've
Yeah.
been talking about how this has been projected for some time in 2021. I don't know how seriously I should take this. I don't know too much about this whole dollar issue, and you know how these libertarian type economists have long been predicting that the dollar would crash as a way to buffer their narrative about how we're overspending, how we need to get rid of this so-called debt burden, and that they're disregarding modern monetary theory, which is a topic in of itself. But this tangent aside, I do expect for there to be a decline of U.S. dollar hegemony, and I do expect for the U.S. imperial implosion, the loss of U.S. Global imperialist power to come to increasingly haunt Americans, and part of this will be part of this will have to do with Biden's ongoing trade war with China. I think it's clear that Biden will not end Trump's trade war with China, and I think it's clear that the contradictions of imperialism we've been seeing in these last 4 years, where the different imperialist powers eke it out for dominance over markets and dominance over trade, these contradictions are going to continue. They were arguably present before Trump. Trump just opened the door to this inevitable era of inter-imperialist fighting, and it's not going to go away during the Biden era, especially with an angry Trump seething around the Biden administration and stirring up political dramas, vilifying Biden's every move whenever he deviates from Trump's policies. And then there's a possibility that Trump will become president again in 2025. But again, there's a whole additional topic. As for 2021, I think that we're going to see more of the kinds of economic trends that we've seen so far, where the implosion of U.S. imperialism will go hand in hand with the internal economic problems that have arisen from decades of neoliberal austerity and economic deterioration and the crises that U.S. capitalism will experience as a result of the decline of U.S. imperial power, the cost of this crisis will be foisted onto the lower classes. The richest billionaires are no doubt going to continue to grow their fortunes as they've been growing their fortunes rapidly in this last year. They're going to find various ways to exploit this crisis and further exacerbate the process of inequality. And then that raises a possibility of a new George Floyd type unrest outbreak. I wonder what the next catalyst event will be. I wonder if it'll be the killing of another unarmed black man. I wonder if it'll be a reaction to the mass eviction crisis that's probably going to happen in these next few months as the government continues to fumble and stumble on top of each other in their meager efforts to materially help the people during this time of crisis. It's really a precarious situation that the U.S. empire has created for itself internally, where millions are at risk of being evicted now. All these evictions are slipping through the cracks. All of these people are becoming homeless, losing their businesses, losing their former ability to afford an adequate amount of food. And as you said, there's going to be some sort of credit debt explosion. The credit debt issue will come to a head, which I think will ultimately result in an Occupy Wall Street type event that's based around class, I think, more explicitly than Black Lives Matter has been, and that will hopefully build upon the lessons that the class struggle in the U.S. has learned from Occupy Wall Street, from the failure of Chaz.
Yes, I agree 100% with everything you just said. And just in general, I expect this upsurge around the world against neoliberalism. And of course, neoliberalism is essential. I mean, I've gone through this in other shows, but it is essential to the survival of the capitalist class and of the capitalist state and of the capitalist state's huge globe spanning empire. It is essential to all of that. It is essential to the future, to the very future of the capitalist class in the United States and in every other country. It is essential. And yet, we've seen over the last year and a half this huge upsurge against neoliberalism. And I believe that we've seen nothing yet to what we're going to see. I don't know if it's going to be, come out in the form of occupations, street occupations, like in the, sit down strikes of the 30s, or, the sit down protests of the 60s, or the Occupy, so-called Occupy movement of the 2011 and 2012. I don't know if it'll take that character or some other character. I think it'll probably take some other character. We'll see. But what I do really believe is that we are going to see this huge upsurge, and we're going to see it. We've already been seeing it for a year and a half. We're going to see it in a much bigger way, in much more places, much more openly in the United States in the next year. What I would like to believe before I die, and it could be, God knows when, any day now, the gods know when, or, the spirits, I don't know, who knows. even though I don't believe in those. I don't know when I'm going to die, but I know that it's going to be a lot quicker than you, Rainer, or than people of your generation. Means a lot more to you than it does to me, but it means everything to me that I would love to see in the future this lead towards real revolutionary action around the world to a global socialist revolution. That's the only way to save humanity, in my opinion. Given the nuclear crisis that we face, the crisis of having insane people like the capitalist ruling class of the United States with their fingers hovering on the button and talking about spending $1 trillion to upgrade all of their nukes and the brinksmanship that they've exhibited, especially since Obama, especially under Trump, and we will see a lot more of it, I'm sure. This brinksmanship under Biden of threatening countries that stand up against imperialism and threatening them with nuclear holocaust. First strike, preemptive strike. The only country in the fucking world that claims the right to first strike is this evil empire, the American empire. That's an existential crisis that's immediate for humanity. The environmental crisis, the sixth great species die off, the global warming, just pollution in general, killing off life. That's a great existential threat to humanity that has to be tackled on a global basis. It's not think locally. No, please, people, don't think locally about this global crisis. Think globally. Think global revolution, because that's what's necessary. And I think, from everything I know as a trained Marxist Leninist, as a person who's studied that pretty much all his adult life and some of his teenage life as well, it really looks more, I'm more encouraged. It looks more like we're facing that. We're more like we're coming into that kind of revolutionary territory than ever in the past. Looks like there's more of a chance now if we seize it. The time is now, people, seize it. That's, what I see in the future. It's pretty fucking optimistic, I admit. It's pretty hopeful. And, we've talked about tonight all of the, fascism that we expect. How will people stand up to that fascism? Will people be brave enough to stand up to that kind of fascism? Hell, in the 1950s and 60s, when I was a little boy growing up, people were afraid of the kind of mild-mannered fascism that the American state exhibited through McCarthyism. They were so afraid they wouldn't even say, "I'm a socialist," like they do now. They get people out on Facebook, hundreds and thousands of people with little placards that say, "I'm a socialist." Imagine that. That's today. You would never, ever have seen anything like that when I was a boy. Ever. People were afraid, and they didn't stand up to this police state back then. Will we stand up now? I hope so. I hope we do. People will have to sacrifice to do that. Many, I think, will be willing to sacrifice. Will it be enough? I don't know. But I'm encouraged more than ever in my life. Just too bad that I'm getting on and into my final golden years to witness this, but at least I'm witnessing it. Along with it comes all of the terrible, terrible tragedy that capitalism and imperialism are causing here in this country and around the world. That's the bad part of this equation. And, you know, all I can say is our power is greater than all of their hoarded gold, to quote the great song, Solidarity Forever. And the union makes us strong, as they say in the United States, or the party makes us strong, as they used to say in the Soviet Union. They used to change the words there when they would sing it, depending on where they were. But basically, the idea is solidarity makes us strong, and organization makes us strong. And our masses, our millions of people together, linked arm in arm, makes us strong. And that's how you stand up to this kind of fascist threat that we are facing. And that's part of what we need to do if we want a bright future instead of a miserable decline for humanity.
Great speech. Great speech. We're at over 2 hours now. I'm because last week because you didn't have very much of an internet last week.
Right. Yeah. So we better wrap it up. Thank everybody for tuning in, for viewing and listening, whatever you do. And look for us next week when it's a new year. And in the meantime, thank you, Rainer. Great contributions as always. And until then, hasta la vista, everybody.